They never told you what really happened at Hollowbrook. They couldn't, because if the truth ever reached your ears, it would rewrite the way you see power itself. The official story died in 1847, buried beneath court silence and plantation ash. 23 enslaved souls vanished. A colonel was found butchered in his bed, and somewhere between those two events, a man named Josiah stopped being property and became something else entirely. What they feared most wasn't his violence. It was his mind. History pretends that rebellion is born of rage. It isn't. It's born of clarity, when a man finally sees that every law around him is a spell designed to keep him asleep. The world of Pike County, Alabama in 1845 was a machine of control so complete that even those enslaved by it were taught to defend it. Cotton, prayer, obedience, 3 words that built an empire. 3 chains that shaped a nation's soul. But at Hollowbrook, one of those chains began to rust. Josiah was a man whose silence frightened even his captors. He obeyed, he labored, he bowed when spoken to, but behind his stillness, something calculated was forming. He studied the rhythm of punishment, the timing of trust. He learned which lies the overseers believed, which fears the master drank with his brandy. Every gesture, every word, every moment of false submission was a brick in the foundation of his revolution, and the land itself seemed to know it. The wind that moved through the pines carried an unease no sermon could silence. Animals grew restless. Workers whispered of strange dreams, of gates opening, of fire in the soil. And at the heart of it all was Josiah, the quiet field hand who watched everything, who listened as if each sound was a code sent from somewhere older than America itself. You see, rebellion is never random. It's a geometry of pain and precision. Josiah understood what most men never do, that systems of domination don't collapse when you fight them directly. They collapse when you make them doubt their own permanence. That was the first crack. Not in the walls of Hollowbrook, but in the illusion that its master was in control. And when that illusion breaks, every hierarchy begins to bleed. The descent has begun. Section 2 will pull you deeper, into the night the plan first took root. It began on a night when the air felt too heavy to breathe. The moon hung low, pale and watchful, like a witness refusing to intervene. In the slave quarters, silence spread like contagion, an unspoken knowing that something was shifting beneath the surface of routine. Josiah sat alone by the dying coals of a fire, his face half lit, half lost in shadow. He wasn't praying. He was remembering. He remembered the auction block in South Carolina, the heat, the smell of blood on iron, and the white hand that branded him as if to erase his humanity. He remembered the songs of his people, once sung to ease sorrow, now turned into coded maps for survival. But what haunted him most were not the memories of pain. It was the memory of order, the precision with which cruelty operated, the machinery of obedience built so perfectly that even rebellion felt like a sin. That night, Josiah decided the machine could be turned against its makers. He began not with weapons, but with words. He spoke softly to the others, about dignity, about freedom not as a dream, but as a right buried under centuries of terror. At first they looked at him with fear because hope was dangerous. Hope could get you killed. But Josiah knew that men are never freed by force alone. They are freed by the idea that force can be theirs. By dawn, the first seeds of revolution were planted, invisible yet irreversible. He taught them to memorize routes through the woods, to count paces between fields, to read signs in nature. Every detail was knowledge, and knowledge was the first taste of power. By day, they still sang hymns and called their master Sir. By night, they built a new language, a language of signals, of glances, of unspoken timing, Catherine Harrove noticed before anyone else. She saw the stillness in Josiah's eyes, the way he looked at the plantation as if measuring its anatomy, dissecting its vulnerabilities. She mistook it at first for quiet intelligence. Later, she would call it prophecy. The South was full of ghosts then, ghosts of the displaced Creek, of Africans stolen and reforged into instruments of labor. But Josiah wasn't haunted. He was listening, to the whispers in the soil, to the old power buried beneath the cotton roots. Something ancient was calling him, and he intended to answer. Section 3 descends into the moment the forbidden alliance begins, Catherine and Josiah's dangerous understanding. It started with a glance. Brief, accidental, yet weighted like an omen. Catherine Harrove stood on the veranda, watching Josiah direct the workers with quiet precision. His movements were efficient, controlled, unnervingly deliberate. She had seen hundreds of enslaved men labor under the sun, but none like him. There was something in the way he held silence, like a man who had already measured his chains and found them temporary. Catherine was not naive. She had read enough forbidden texts from her father's library to sense the contradictions in her world. Philosophy, revolution, abolition, ideas that were safe in books but lethal in practice. She'd been taught that the order of things was divine, yet when she looked at Josiah, she saw divinity in defiance. That recognition, quiet, shameful, magnetic, was the beginning of her unraveling. She began finding excuses to speak with him. Questions about harvest yield, crop rotation, overseer reports, pretext for conversation. But beneath those exchanges lived something deeper, curiosity edged with danger. Josiah answered her with perfect restraint, his words polite yet sharp, revealing fragments of intellect he was supposed to hide. Their conversations became tests, each probing how far the other dared to step beyond the invisible wall of hierarchy. Late one afternoon, a thunderstorm rolled over Hollowbrook. The workers scattered for shelter. Catherine stood by the open window as rain lashed against the glass. Josiah was still outside, securing the last of the tools. Lightning illuminated him in bursts, his face wet, eyes fierce, unyielding. When he finally entered the house to report the damage, she saw something in him that terrified her. Command. Not the kind bred from inheritance, but the kind born of self-possession, the authority of a man who knew his purpose. That night, she dreamed of him standing over her father's desk, tearing pages from ledgers, burning contracts, unbinding names. She woke trembling, her heart pounding with guilt and fascination. She told herself it was madness, yet by morning she left one of her books on the steps outside, the writings of John Locke on natural rights, where she knew Josiah would find it. He did. And though neither spoke of it, a silent covenant had been sealed. Power had found its mirror in compassion, and compassion had found its weapon in intellect. What began as curiosity would soon become treason. Control doesn't begin with rebellion. It begins with obedience, perfect, convincing, weaponized obedience. Josiah understood that better than any man alive. The colonel believed he'd tamed him by giving him authority, by making him overseer of his own people. But Josiah saw it for what it was, access. A key disguised as privilege. And once a man learns the rhythm of his chains, he can begin to dance around them. Each day, Josiah mastered the plantation's heartbeat. He knew which tools broke most often, which locks rusted fastest, which guards drank too much corn whiskey to stay awake. He catalogued weaknesses with the mind of a strategist, not a servant. But what made him truly dangerous wasn't his intelligence, it was his patience. The kind of patience that turns suffering into calculation. He began to invert the plantation's order in subtle ways. When the colonel commanded punishment, Josiah delayed it, softened it, or redirected it entirely. He learned to make cruelty look efficient, to disguise mercy as discipline. In doing so, he earned the trust of both master and slave. The colonel saw loyalty. The workers saw protection. Only Josiah saw the truth, that both were pieces on his board, moving exactly as he intended. At night, he taught the others without teaching them. He asked questions instead of giving orders. "What if there was no master?" he'd say softly. "What would we build?" He taught them arithmetic through crop tallies, geography through escape routes, scripture through subversion. Each lesson rewired a mind the system had broken. He was not training followers. He was building architects of a new world, one born in whispers, growing under the radar of empire. Catherine felt it in the air. A subtle electricity, an invisible rebellion moving beneath the routine of labor. She didn't know its full scope, but she sensed Josiah was orchestrating something beyond comprehension. When she looked into his eyes, she saw both serenity and danger. The calm of a man who had already crossed a moral threshold he could never return from. The plantation slept each night under the illusion of peace. But Hollowbrook had become something else, a living organism with two hearts beating out of sync. The master's order and Josiah's design, and the space between them was tightening like a noose. By winter, Hollowbrook began to change, not in appearance, but in atmosphere. The fields were the same, the fences the same. The house still gleamed white in the morning light. But something beneath the soil had shifted. Even the animals sensed it. The dogs refused to go near the quarters after dark. Horses kicked at empty air as if some unseen presence brushed against them. Workers whispered that the land was listening now, storing every secret it had been forced to bear. Josiah knew the power of that belief. He fed it, not with lies, but with symbols. He marked trees along the property with carved triangles, told the workers they represented protection, but in truth they were signals, coordinates, routes, meeting points. He left small stones arranged in circles behind the quarters, and when the others found them, they felt chosen, seen, part of something invisible, but alive. That was how he built unity, not with promises, but with mystery. Colonel Harrove remained blind to it all. His wealth had made him deaf to tremors of revolt, and his faith in hierarchy was absolute. He'd look out across the fields and see harmony. But what he saw was choreography, every motion rehearsed under Josiah's silent direction. Even Catherine noticed her father's growing complacency, his tendency to underestimate the man he called my best investment. She wanted to warn him, but something stopped her. Maybe it was fear, maybe fascination, or maybe the dawning awareness that some cages deserved to burn. At night, when the wind rose through the pines, Catherine could hear faint singing from the quarters, not the usual hymns, but something deeper, older. It carried a rhythm that didn't belong to the church, a pulse that came from before America, before chains. The melody haunted her dreams, filling them with images she couldn't explain, flames in the distance, faces illuminated by firelight, the sound of footsteps marching toward something irreversible. The more she listened, the more she realized what was coming wasn't merely rebellion, it was reckoning. Hollowbrook was no longer just a plantation. It was a crucible. The system had created the perfect instrument of its own destruction, and his name was Josiah. He wasn't just defying his master. He was awakening the land itself to remember what it once was, free. The night it began, the air carried a silence so thick it felt deliberate, like the world was holding its breath. The moon hung high, sharp as a blade, throwing silver light over the rows of cotton that shimmered like ghosts waiting for release. Josiah stood alone by the overseer's cottage, the key to the main house cold in his palm. For months, he had played his part perfectly, obedient servant, trusted hand, loyal overseer. But tonight, obedience would become the weapon that broke its master. Inside the quarters, 22 men and women waited. No torches, no noise, just the sound of restrained breathing and the faint rustle of resolve. Josiah had taught them that rebellion didn't begin with shouting, it began with control. Emotion was the enemy of precision, and precision was survival. He moved among them, whispering the plan one last time. Every route, every signal, every name. No one would act without purpose. Chaos was for fools. This was design. In the main house, Colonel Harrove slept under the illusion of command. His pistol rested by the bedside, his Bible open on the nightstand to a psalm about obedience. He never heard the door open, never saw Josiah standing in the doorway, the candlelight catching the edge of steel. For a moment, Josiah hesitated, not out of fear, but calculation. What he was about to do wasn't vengeance. It was symmetry. The system that turned men into tools was about to feel the weight of its own making. When it was over, there was no scream, no chaos, only silence. A single act that ended centuries of inherited arrogance. Blood soaked the floorboards of Hollowbrook, seeping into the same soil that had swallowed generations of the enslaved. Josiah didn't run. He walked outside into the open air and looked toward the quarters. A faint wind moved through the fields. From the distance came a sound, soft at first, then growing. A low hum, the sound of 22 voices singing the same forbidden hymn. It wasn't mourning. It was declaration. At that moment, Hollowbrook ceased to belong to the living who claimed it. It belonged to the dead who had waited for justice, and to the man who finally delivered it. Morning at Hollowbrook carried a strange, almost sacred weight. The sun rose over cotton fields that had known nothing but labor and fear, yet now seemed to shimmer with possibility. To any passerby, the plantation looked untouched, neat rows of white stalks, the main house intact, the land humming with the illusion of order. But those who understood would know. Nothing would ever be the same. The colonel was gone. Official records would later claim illness, a tragic accident, even suicide, but no truth was written anywhere. His daughter, Catherine, vanished from public sight. Rumors whispered that she had fled north, that she had been taken, that she had died. None of it matched what really happened. A pact had been formed, secret and terrifying in its implications. The system's symbols, the ledger, the whip, the plantation schedule, remained, but their power was hollow. Josiah moved among the quarters like a shadow reborn. The enslaved workers no longer looked to him with fear or cautious respect. They looked with understanding. He had not simply freed them from the colonel's authority. He had given them agency, and with agency comes clarity. Men who had once bent under chains now walked with the quiet confidence of architects, engineers of a reality they had been taught could never exist. Orders were no longer whispered from the veranda. They were shared in soft, coded language. Lessons that had begun as simple arithmetic and literacy became strategies for self-governance. He taught them how to ration supplies, defend the perimeter, and communicate with secrecy. Every task reinforced one fact: they were no longer property. They were the inheritors of Hollowbrook. Catherine's role was subtle but crucial. She navigated the world outside the plantation, the neighbors, the county officials, the gossiping landowners, and diverted suspicion. She wrote letters, misdirected inquiries, fed stories that kept the outside world believing Hollowbrook was intact, obedient, normal. Her compliance was a mask, as carefully constructed as Josiah's obedience had once been. But beneath the veneer, something older and darker thrummed. Hollowbrook had become a laboratory of power, a place where the rules of domination were inverted, tested, and rewritten. Every wall, every field, every tool was now part of a system that belonged to the enslaved. Josiah understood something few men ever grasp. Liberation is not granted. It is seized, measured, and maintained, and the cost is always higher than the world will ever acknowledge. The world outside would never learn the full truth. They would only see the story that maintained their comfort: a plantation operating normally, a colonel gone, a mystery buried. But the men and women who lived it knew better. The power of Hollowbrook had shifted, quietly, irreversibly. Power is invisible. That is the first rule Josiah understood, and the last rule his enemies would ever learn. Weapons can be seized, land can be taken, but knowledge is a fortress. Hollowbrook, now in the hands of those it once enslaved, became a school of silent mastery. Every secret the colonel had hoarded, accounts, contracts, debts, routines, was catalogued by Josiah, not for personal gain, but for strategy. He transformed information into armor, and armor into freedom. He walked the quarters at night, not to command, but to observe. Every man and woman had been given a task, a role in a system designed to mirror the plantation's former hierarchy, but inverted. Supervisors were chosen not for obedience, but for intelligence. Messengers were trained not for speed, but for discretion. The smallest slip in protocol could reveal them. Yet each person had learned to operate as though the weight of 1,000 overseers rested upon their shoulders, and to thrive under it. Catherine remained at his side, the silent agent who moved through polite society with the ease of someone invisible yet all-seeing. She delivered letters, smoothed over inquiries, created diversions. No outsider suspected that the man they had once enslaved now controlled every movement of the plantation, and that the daughter of the former master was his accomplice. The brilliance of it lay in perception. The world still believed Hollowbrook was ruled by its master. Yet in reality, every decision, every resource, every human motion bent to Josiah's will. Josiah taught the others to read and write under the cover of religious instruction. He encoded messages in hymnals and agricultural ledgers. What appeared to be a simple accounting of cotton yields was in truth a map of escape, defense, and contingency. Every piece of knowledge was dual purpose. It gave practical instruction while reinforcing power. The enslaved were no longer just workers. They were strategists, sentinels, silent architects of a rebellion that had already succeeded without firing a single shot. The most dangerous lesson Josiah instilled was this: the mind is a weapon sharper than any blade. Fear is its ally. Patience is its fuel. Trust is selective. And secrecy is the only shield that guarantees survival. Those who learned this could never be controlled again. Hollowbrook became a living paradox. To the world, it remained a plantation, obedient and productive. To those who understood, it was a fortress of intellect, a laboratory of liberation, a place where the rules of domination had been rewritten with invisible ink. And at its center stood Josiah, the man who had turned servitude into strategy, obedience into control, and silence into the most terrifying instrument of power the South had ever seen. Hollowbrook's silence could not last forever. Word traveled, as it always does, carried by whispers on the wind, the suspicious eyes of neighbors, and the instinctive fear of men who sensed their authority slipping. By early 1846, murmurs reached nearby plantations. Something unusual was unfolding at Hollowbrook. Crops were immaculate, laborers obedient yet different, more confident, more precise, too well coordinated to be natural. Josiah anticipated this moment long before the first glances arrived. He had studied the county's social mechanics as carefully as he had studied the plantation itself. He knew who would notice, who would gossip, who would demand proof. And he prepared not just for suspicion, but for its weaponization. He understood that panic among those who believe themselves secure is more destructive than bullets or blades. Colonel Harrove's neighbors, men whose wealth and pride defined them, began to visit Hollowbrook under pretense, curiosity masquerading as casual inspection. They rode in on fine horses, polished boots, and air thick with entitlement. They spoke in clipped tones, evaluated the workers' manners, the tidiness of the fields, the colonel's ledger. They were hunters in territory they thought familiar, but every step they took had already been anticipated. Josiah greeted them with flawless civility. Every question they asked, he answered with precise, measured confidence. Every observation they made, he reinforced with subtle misdirection. A ledger page, a casual remark, a scheduling detail. Each was a brushstroke in a carefully painted illusion of obedience and order. To the outsiders, Hollowbrook was perfectly normal, more productive than expected, a model plantation. To Josiah, it was a chessboard, and the visitors were moving exactly as he intended. Meanwhile, the workers moved with purpose but invisibility. Their obedience was a weapon, their precision a shield. Each glance, each movement, each whispered routine maintained the deception, building a lattice of trust and fear around the observers. Those who sought to expose Hollowbrook's secret left convinced the plantation operated under the same hierarchy they understood. They did not know that the real authority had changed hands, and that those they considered powerless now held the reins of both knowledge and destiny. Catherine watched from the veranda, her posture relaxed, her eyes betraying nothing. She had mastered the art of invisibility, moving through polite society with subtlety, diverting suspicion before it could harden into scrutiny. Together, she and Josiah had become two halves of a single organism, one operating in plain sight, the other in shadows, both orchestrating the impossible. Hollowbrook had survived its first test, and yet the larger world loomed. The whispers would grow louder, curiosity would become obsession, and soon the law, the neighbors, and the system itself would come knocking, unknowing that their every move had already been anticipated, studied, and used against them. Josiah understood that power without preparation is a trap. The enslaved at Hollowbrook were no longer mere laborers. They were instruments, each sharpened to precision, each mind tempered like steel. But steel left untended rusts. Knowledge left unused decays. That night in the largest quarters he gathered them. Candlelight flickered against determined faces, shadows dancing like the ghosts of the past that had shaped them. He began with a lesson that would define everything. The first rule of control: anticipate. Do not react, he said quietly, his voice a low current that carried through the room. Predict, plan, move before they realize there is a choice. A free man sees 3 steps ahead. A slave sees none. The words landed like stones thrown into a still pond. Eyes widened, minds opening to a concept that was as dangerous as it was liberating. Anticipation was not just survival. It was sovereignty. He taught them to read the patterns in the colonel's habits, the timing of the overseer's walks, the cadence of neighbors' visits. Each routine was a map, each human weakness a path to leverage. He demonstrated how compliance could be a weapon, how obedience could be a veil for unseen authority. Every small task, every chore, every whispered instruction became a tool for shaping perception. The illusion of servitude could be turned into a fortress. Catherine observed from the doorway, silently documenting the transformation. She understood now that Josiah's genius lay not in brute action, but in strategy. Men and women who once bent under whips now carried the confidence of architects of their own destiny. They learned that control is invisible, that fear can be redirected, and that the most potent weapon is knowledge applied before the world even knows it exists. By the end of the night, the workers had internalized the lesson. They moved silently through the quarters, their minds alive with contingencies. Every shadow became a signal, every creak of the floorboard a message. Josiah had forged them into sentinels and strategists, and each knew their role in the invisible web of command he had spun across Hollowbrook. Outside, the wind howled through the pines, carrying whispers of the past, the stolen and the betrayed. It seemed to recognize the shift, acknowledging that the plantation was no longer a place of enforced obedience. Hollowbrook had become a laboratory of mastery, where the oppressed had learned to wield power in ways their captors could not perceive. The stage was set. Anticipation was their shield. Control, their hidden weapon. And Josiah, the man once purchased as property, stood at the center, the quiet architect of a revolution the world would never see coming. The first symbolic act of defiance came not with violence, but with ceremony. In the dead of night, the workers gathered at the edge of the fields, where the soil was soft and the moon carved silver paths through the cotton stalks. Josiah stood before them, a single candle illuminating his face. Every eye was fixed on him, not with fear, but with understanding, the recognition that history was being rewritten in real time, beneath a sky that had witnessed centuries of oppression. He lifted a small, carved wooden figure, a tool once used to mark rows of cotton, and placed it on the ground. This, he said, represents us, not as property, not as instruments of another man's profit, but as architects of our own fate. Remember this symbol. Protect it. Let it remind you that what you carry in your mind cannot be taken. The workers nodded. The gesture was simple, almost invisible, yet its weight was absolute. It marked the moment when obedience became purpose, when survival became strategy, when fear became mastery. Catherine stood a few steps back, her heart pounding with a combination of awe and terror. She had crossed a threshold she could never return from. By aiding Josiah, placing forbidden texts in the quarters, diverting suspicion, providing coded signals, she had chosen a side. Every act of her compliance had been a conscious rebellion. Every gesture, every word, every glance now carried consequences that reached far beyond Hollowbrook. She was no longer just an observer. She was a participant in a revolution that would haunt every corner of Pike County. Josiah spoke then of loyalty, not the loyalty taught by masters, which was blind and conditional, but the loyalty that comes from shared purpose. He taught them to trust in one another, to rely on signals, to move in silence yet with certainty. Each person present understood that they were the first generation of their own destiny, and that the smallest misstep could undo everything. The risk was immense, yet it was the only path to freedom that was real, not imagined. Before the night ended, Josiah turned to Catherine. "If you wish to survive this world with us," he said, voice steady, "you must commit fully. Speak the phrase with me." She repeated it aloud, twice. "The land remembers. The land remembers." Words that would bind them together. A secret that encoded identity and purpose. a mantra that locked in transformation. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the whispered echoes of the enslaved and the unspoken fear of those who believed the plantation still belonged to them. Hollowbrook was no longer merely a place. It was a force, alive with strategy, secrecy, and the unyielding will of those who had refused to remain broken. The first real threat came not from open rebellion, but from suspicion, the quiet kind that gnaws at the bones of those who believe themselves secure. Neighboring planters had begun to notice anomalies. Cotton tallied perfectly, workers moving with eerie coordination, Hollowbrook appearing untouched by the chaos surrounding other estates. They rode in with polite smiles and clipped questions, unaware that every syllable they uttered had already been accounted for. Josiah was ready. He greeted them with the precision of a seasoned general. Every gesture measured, every word weighed. The ledger lay open, a carefully choreographed display of numbers, schedules, and mundane details. The colonel's former neighbors saw efficiency, obedience, and the illusion of a plantation perfectly managed. They saw nothing of the web that had been woven beneath their feet, the invisible machinery turning every routine into a shield and every action into a trap. Inside the quarters, the workers moved like shadows, each executing routines rehearsed in silence. Their obedience was a weapon, a deception, a performance designed to disarm curiosity. Every glance, every nod, every action reinforced the narrative that Hollowbrook remained under the familiar hierarchy. In truth, the entire system now belonged to Josiah and the people he had trained. The plantation had become a fortress of intellect disguised as labor. Catherine's role was equally critical. She attended to the visitors with the grace expected of a planter's daughter, her demeanor flawless. Questions were met with carefully crafted responses, diversions woven seamlessly into conversation. She ensured that any probe into Hollowbrook's operations remained superficial, feeding the visitors a steady stream of plausible normalcy. Every letter she wrote, every report she filed was a thread in the fabric of deception, a mirror reflecting power where none existed. Josiah watched it all, calculating, observing, adjusting. He understood perception was more potent than confrontation. Men who believe themselves in control will act with arrogance, blinded by the certainty of their assumptions. Josiah weaponized that arrogance, bending it to protect Hollowbrook without a drop of blood spilled. By the time the visitors departed, they were convinced Hollowbrook was ordinary, efficient, and loyal. In reality, they had glimpsed nothing. They had been allowed to believe they were in control, even as every plan, every contingency, and every moment of potential risk was anticipated and neutralized. Hollowbrook had survived its first external scrutiny, and the system Josiah had built had proven flawless, not because of strength, but because of foresight, discipline, and the absolute command of knowledge. Even the most disciplined system contains fissures. Hollowbrook, despite its precision, was not immune to the human heart. Fear, desire, and doubt lingered in the quarters, subtle and persistent. Josiah understood this better than anyone. He knew that true control requires mastery not just of the external, but of the internal. The mind of a man can be both shield and saboteur. He had to ensure that loyalty remained absolute, that purpose never wavered. One night, as the wind swept through the cotton, Josiah called a gathering. Faces, lit by a single flickering candle, looked to him for direction. He spoke of vigilance, of trust, and of the invisible enemy within. Even here in our sanctuary, shadows of fear exist, he said. Doubt will gnaw at you. Desire will tempt you. But remember, our strength comes from unity, and unity comes from discipline. Every thought, every action, every whisper must serve the purpose. Otherwise, the world will devour us. He then demonstrated what the world outside would never understand: psychological mastery. A man named Eli, strong but brash, had questioned a route Josiah had laid out for a supply run. Josiah did not punish him. He simply placed Eli at the center of the next exercise, giving him responsibility for a small, controlled operation. Eli executed flawlessly, his confidence growing, but it was Josiah's control all along. By directing fear into purpose, doubt into precision, he transformed hesitation into loyalty and insecurity into weaponized competence. Catherine watched from the doorway, recognizing the brilliance and danger of what she witnessed. Josiah was not merely teaching obedience. He was teaching the mechanics of power, of self-mastery, of influence over others without the need for overt force. He was shaping minds into instruments, silent, effective, and lethal in their subtlety. By the end of the session, every worker had internalized the lesson. They moved with a unity that appeared instinctive but was meticulously engineered. Fear had been harnessed. Desire had been directed. Doubt had been transformed into strategic anticipation. Hollowbrook was no longer just a plantation. It was a laboratory of control, a fortress of the mind as much as the body, a place where the enslaved wielded the invisible weapons of intellect, psychology, and foresight. The world beyond Hollowbrook had no inkling that the soil, the trees, and the wind themselves now carried strategy, coded in gestures, glances, and silence. Josiah's revolution was not merely physical, it was cognitive, psychological, absolute. Even the most disciplined fortress harbors cracks. Hollowbrook was no exception. One evening, Josiah sensed it, a subtle shift in the air, the tiniest hesitation in a man he had trained to anticipate every outcome. Eli, once his most dependable strategist, lingered too long at a corner, glanced too frequently at the veranda where Catherine might be watching, whispered a word that carried the faintest tremor of doubt. Josiah understood immediately. A seed of betrayal had taken root. He called a meeting in the largest cabin, candlelight illuminating the tense faces of the workers. Josiah did not accuse. Accusation is clumsy. It reveals fear. Instead, he framed the lesson in universal terms, as if testing the group's cohesion. "The world outside is ruthless," he said, voice steady, commanding. "We survive because we move as one, because we anticipate, because we trust that each man's thought and action serves the whole. A single deviation threatens everything we have built. A shadow can topple a fortress." The effect was electric. Every pair of eyes shifted, seeking the tremor of insubordination. Josiah walked among them, slow, deliberate, every step reinforcing the invisible hierarchy he had constructed. He stopped before Eli, whose composure wavered. "Your mind wanders and the world notices. Do you wish the world to notice, or do you wish to master it?" Eli swallowed, nodded, understanding that resistance was not an act of courage, but a path to ruin. Catherine's role in this was crucial. She had been observing patterns in the county, noting neighbors' suspicions, learning subtle human cues. She understood now that loyalty cannot be demanded. It must be reinforced through perception, fear, and alignment of purpose. She whispered coded instructions to Josiah afterward, adjustments for contingencies he had not yet anticipated. Hollowbrook's defense was no longer just physical or strategic. It had become a psychological web, extending from the workers to the very edges of the plantation. By the end of the night, Eli had been reabsorbed into the system, his doubt transformed into vigilance, his hesitation into cautious mastery. The others had seen the lesson. Betrayal, even unspoken, carries consequences far beyond the individual. Hollowbrook was a living organism now, every mind a neuron in a network of control. Josiah had not only preserved the system, he had refined it, hardened it, made it resilient against fear, desire, and human frailty. The plantation soil had absorbed centuries of labor, suffering, and secrets. Tonight, it absorbed something new: discipline, loyalty, and the quiet terror that comes from understanding the invisible hand guiding every action. Hollowbrook was no longer just a place. It was a mind, and Josiah was its central intelligence. The external threat arrived like a storm nobody could see coming. A neighboring planter, suspicious and aggressive, rode to Hollowbrook accompanied by 2 deputies, his horse hooves drumming like a warning across the frozen earth. He came with questions, curiosity sharpened into accusation, rumors of unrest circulating faster than the winter wind. He believed he was confronting disorder. He believed he could extract truth. He had no idea that Hollowbrook was already a fortress, and that the fortress had learned to anticipate him. Josiah stood on the veranda, calm and deliberate, greeting the men with the precision of a master tactician. Every word was chosen to reinforce the illusion of order, every gesture a signal to the workers hidden just out of view. The ledger lay open, meticulously updated as if nothing had changed. The workers themselves moved silently in the background, executing routines rehearsed to the point of instinct. To the intruders, Hollowbrook was obedient, normal, untouched by the fires of rebellion that had been kindled within its walls. The planters' questions were sharp, probing for inconsistencies, for signs of disobedience or conspiracy. Josiah answered them with a measured cadence, revealing enough detail to satisfy curiosity, but nothing that would betray the invisible system he had built. Each response subtly misdirected suspicion, weaving the visitors into a narrative of control where none truly existed. The more they pressed, the more they confirmed the illusion. They believed themselves masters, yet were unknowingly maneuvered across the board by a man they once considered property. Catherine circulated quietly, subtly reinforcing Josiah's narrative. She answered minor queries, diverted attention from sensitive areas, and guided the visitor's perception with the practiced elegance of someone accustomed to being invisible, yet omnipresent. Every movement, every glance, every word maintained the deception. Hollowbrook appeared loyal, functional, and above all, predictable. But beneath the calm exterior, Josiah was not idle. He calculated every contingency, anticipating the men's next questions, their likely movements, the points at which their arrogance would betray them. His control was not brute force. It was psychological, strategic, and absolute. The visitors left convinced they had seen order, efficiency, and compliance, never realizing that every observation, every impression, had been meticulously curated to protect the secret of Hollowbrook. As the last hoofbeats faded, Josiah turned to the workers and Catherine. Their eyes met, unspoken acknowledgement passing between them. The fortress had held. Hollowbrook had survived scrutiny not through strength alone, but through intelligence, deception, and mastery over the minds of those who thought themselves in control. With the external threat repelled, Hollowbrook entered a new phase. Josiah knew that surviving scrutiny was only the beginning. Power, like a living organism, must be cultivated, expanded, and fortified. He gathered the workers in the quarters and spoke of the next lesson, influence. Control is not merely surviving the world, he said, voice low and deliberate. It is shaping it. Every choice they make can serve us or destroy us. We will ensure it serves us. He began teaching subtlety, the art of operating in plain sight while bending perception. Workers learned to speak one thing while meaning another, to carry out orders in ways that reinforced the illusion of obedience, but executed hidden objectives. Every gesture, every routine, every glance became an instrument of strategy. Hollowbrook was no longer a plantation. It was a system of psychological warfare disguised as labor. Catherine's role intensified. She monitored the county, the neighbors, the flow of gossip, and every correspondence that could hint at Hollowbrook's secret. She became a shadow operative, her movements choreographed to protect their autonomy. Josiah taught her the language of influence, subtle signals and misdirection that could divert attention from the invisible web of control he had built. Together they orchestrated a system where perception was more powerful than action, and knowledge more dangerous than force. He also introduced the concept of contingencies. Every plan had layers, every instruction multiple interpretations. Workers were trained to adapt, to anticipate the anticipators, to act before the outside world realized a choice existed. They practiced silent communication, memorized routes, and rehearsed scenarios that the world could never imagine. Hollowbrook became a living network, a mind where every node was a guardian, every thought a defensive weapon. But Josiah understood the limits of loyalty and the fragility of human nature. He reinforced the psychological bonds between the workers through shared purpose and symbolic acts. Each ritual, each encoded instruction, strengthened their identity as architects of their own destiny. Catherine repeated the phrase with them when tension rose. The land remembers. The land remembers. It was more than mantra. It was a binding of minds, a lock upon transformation, a declaration of sovereignty over what was once stolen. By the end of this phase, Hollowbrook was no longer just a plantation in the eyes of its people. It was a fortress of intellect, a laboratory of hidden power, a place where every action reinforced dominance over perception, every thought sharpened survival, and every secret was a weapon. The world outside remained oblivious. Inside, they were sovereign. The first attempt at infiltration came quietly, almost imperceptibly. A stranger appeared on the edge of Hollowbrook one cold morning, posing as a traveling merchant, a harmless visitor seeking trade. He carried a ledger of supplies, coins glinting faintly in the sun, and a notebook of questions disguised as curiosity. To the untrained eye, he was nothing more than an itinerant salesman. To Josiah, he was a threat, a single anomaly that could unravel months of careful orchestration. Josiah watched him from the veranda, eyes narrowing. Every step, every gesture, every glance was analyzed. The stranger lingered too long near the overseer's cottage, asked questions about routine that seemed casual, but carried the subtle weight of investigation. Josiah recognized the pattern immediately. This was not an innocent traveler. This was a scout, a mind probing for cracks in Hollowbrook's defenses. And Josiah knew that those who underestimated the fortress would pay dearly. He called a discreet meeting with the workers. Not alarm, not panic, calm, controlled instruction. "Observe," he said, voice low, commanding attention. "Do not act unless necessary. Let him think he moves freely. Every move he makes, every question he asks, feeds our knowledge. He believes himself the hunter. He does not yet know he is the prey." Every worker understood their role. They moved like shadows, silent and precise, invisible yet omnipresent, every action rehearsed to protect the secret of Hollowbrook. Catherine, ever the shadow operative, intercepted letters and notes that might have exposed them. She spoke to the merchant with charm and deference, diverting his attention from sensitive areas, planting misleading details, and gently nudging him toward conclusions that served Hollowbrook's security. Every step was calculated, every word a tool of misdirection. He left believing he had gathered information, unaware that every observation had been anticipated, catalogued, and neutralized. Josiah's brilliance was not just in defense, it was in manipulation. He transformed the threat into an asset. The stranger's own curiosity became a map of what the outside world sought, revealing the fears, assumptions, and blind spots of those who might challenge Hollowbrook next. The workers internalized the lesson. Intelligence is not static. Control comes from anticipating thought itself, bending perception before action, and turning enemies into unwitting instruments of strategy. By nightfall, Hollowbrook had emerged stronger. Every mind within it was sharpened, every secret reinforced, every perimeter invisible yet impenetrable. The plantation was no longer a place of labor. It was a citadel of intellect, anticipation, and unseen power, and at its heart stood Josiah, the man who had once been property, now master of every dimension the world would never perceive. The bond between Josiah and Catherine had become the unseen pillar of Hollowbrook. Alone, each was formidable. Together, they were untouchable. Their relationship was not built on affection alone. It was strategy, symbiosis, a fusion of intellect and intuition. Each anticipated the other's thoughts, movements, and decisions. Every plan Josiah devised relied on her vigilance. Every diversion Catherine orchestrated depended on his guidance. Their unity became a final, unbreachable layer of security, a shield that no outsider could penetrate. Catherine had shed the naivete of her upbringing. No longer merely the colonel's daughter, she now understood the mechanics of influence and manipulation, the subtle levers of human behavior that Josiah wielded like instruments of war. She read the county like a book, anticipating suspicion, predicting visits, crafting narratives that deflected curiosity without leaving gaps. Her compliance was a weapon, deceptive in appearance, absolute in effect. Every word she spoke reinforced the illusion of obedience while protecting the unseen authority of Hollowbrook. Josiah, for his part, relied on her as an extension of his own mind. Every contingency, every risk, every potential breach was measured against her presence. Together, they had become a network of thought, a silent communication operating beyond the comprehension of those who still believed themselves masters. They shared a glance, a gesture, a pause, and the meaning was absolute. They needed no words because their unity itself was strategy. The workers, too, felt the ripple of this bond. Their loyalty, already forged through shared purpose and discipline, now expanded into a web of trust, anchored by Josiah and Catherine. They internalized that the survival of Hollowbrook depended not just on obedience or strategy, but on the symbiotic force at its center. When the outside world threatened, the couple's coordination became a force multiplier, making every worker a part of an invisible, intelligent network. Ready to respond before danger fully materialized, every day, Hollowbrook's power grew. Knowledge, secrecy, and psychological mastery were refined. Symbols like the wooden figure, mantras repeated in whispers, "The land remembers. The land remembers," were not mere rituals. They were threads weaving minds into a collective consciousness, embedding loyalty, vigilance, and identity into the very fabric of the plantation. Catherine's presence amplified every act, every strategy, every subtle manipulation, reinforcing the invisible fortress Josiah had built. By now, Hollowbrook was more than a plantation. It was a mind, a system, a citadel of intellect and invisible power. And at its center, Josiah and Catherine moved as one, a silent, perfect engine driving a revolution the outside world could never see or comprehend. The second attempt to penetrate Hollowbrook came with subtlety and cunning. A federal inspector, posing as a routine auditor, arrived with papers, pens, and an air of authority that demanded compliance. He carried questions hidden behind polite phrasing, probing for irregularities in labor, accounts, and security. To most, his visit was procedural. To Josiah, it was a challenge, a live exercise in perception, strategy, and psychological control. Every step he took, every word he asked, had already been anticipated, mapped, and neutralized before he even crossed the threshold. Josiah met the inspector on the veranda with calm precision. He exuded competence and obedience, projecting the very image of a loyal overseer. The ledger lay open, calculations exact, entries spotless. Every worker in sight moved as expected, diligent, deferential, unremarkable. Catherine appeared in the background, her presence subtle but pivotal, guiding the conversation, offering distractions, and directing the inspector's attention to innocuous details. Every word, every gesture, every glance was a carefully crafted part of the deception. But Josiah did not merely deflect suspicion, he weaponized it. He allowed the inspector to believe he had uncovered minor inconsistencies, misplaced receipts, small inefficiencies, minor errors that seemed suspicious but were entirely harmless. Each discovery reinforced the inspector's belief that he had gained insight, subtly inflating his ego and drawing him deeper into Hollowbrook's invisible web. By the time the inspector thought he had learned anything significant, every move he had made had been catalogued, analyzed, and converted into strategic intelligence. The fortress had transformed an intruder into an unwitting informant. Catherine's subtle signals ensured the operation's success. A hand on a ledger, a question deflected, a smile masking insight, all amplified the illusion of transparency while safeguarding every secret. Workers executed silent cues, demonstrating obedience while concealing knowledge. The inspector left convinced he had inspected thoroughly, unaware that every observation he believed he had made was part of a narrative Josiah had authored. Hollowbrook had survived again, not through force, but through mastery of perception and manipulation of human expectation. This moment marked a pinnacle in Hollowbrook's transformation. The plantation was no longer just a physical space. It was an organism of intelligence, a network of minds synchronized through secrecy, discipline, and anticipation. Josiah and Catherine's bond, the psychological training of the workers, and the careful orchestration of perception had created a fortress that could survive scrutiny from any direction. Every challenge became an opportunity, every threat a tool to sharpen the system, and every intruder a participant in their invisible revolution. Hollowbrook had become more than a plantation. It had become a mind, a system, a fortress of invisible power. The soil carried the weight of centuries of labor and suffering, now infused with strategy, foresight, and silent rebellion. Every corner, every shadow, every routine had been transformed into a mechanism of control. Those who once bent beneath the whip now moved as architects of destiny, their thoughts synchronized, their actions precise, their loyalty absolute. Josiah stood at the center of this transformation, not as a figure of tyranny, but as the quiet architect of freedom. He had turned captivity into power, obedience into intelligence, fear into strategy. Every worker had become an extension of his will, every gesture an instrument of calculated influence. And Catherine, once the daughter of the man whose wealth depended on stolen labor, had become his partner in mastery, the final piece of a system that no outsider could penetrate, no adversary could dismantle. Together, they were a single intelligence operating across the landscape, invisible, untouchable, unstoppable. The wooden figure, the whispered mantra, the land remembers. The land remembers were more than symbols. They were keys, locking identity, purpose, and transformation into every mind within Hollowbrook. Those who had once been enslaved now carried sovereignty in their thoughts, mastery in their strategies, and the certainty that the world they had inherited was no longer their master. They had glimpsed a power hidden from most men, a power to shape perception, to bend expectation, to survive and thrive where others would fail. Outside, the world remained unaware. Neighbors continued their routines, planters assumed compliance, and officials believed their inspections had been thorough. Yet every intruder, every skeptic, every curious observer had been drawn into the web Josiah had woven, made a participant in Hollowbrook's invisible revolution. Knowledge, anticipation, and psychological mastery were the weapons, and Hollowbrook wielded them with precision no one could imagine. The plantation, once a symbol of oppression, had become a crucible of intellect, strategy, and power. Those within its walls had been transformed, not just in circumstance, but in mind, spirit, and identity. Josiah had turned the impossible into reality, and in doing so had created a hidden empire of influence, resilience, and sovereignty. The revolution was complete. Not a single battle fought in daylight, but a conquest of perception, control, and mastery that would endure long after the cotton was harvested and the outside world believed it had prevailed. Hollowbrook remembered, and so did those who lived there. And in remembering, they had claimed a power no law, no whip, no hierarchy could ever take away. They were free, not just in body, but in mind, a transformation the world would never record, but one that would echo in the shadows of history forever. The story ends here, but the lesson remains. True freedom is not granted, it is seized, cultivated, and mastered in silence, in strategy, and in the invisible architecture of power.